And thank you for inviting me today. I am a professor of communication and probably a little bit different than prior people who've given talks here. I want to start out, I know oftentimes we acknowledge our co-authors at the end of a project, but I'd like to really just start out with the folks that I've worked with on the work that I'll be talking about today. You can see their names, Shan Shui Conservation Organization, which is an organization that was central to the projects that I'll be talking about today. Rain Liu, who's now a professor, but was my graduate student during the course of this research, and that was wonderful. She's now at University of Arizona in the Department of Communication. John Kerr, who's in the Community of Sustainability Department here at MSU, and Jinhua Zhao, who's in economics and agricultural economics. Sering Boom, who's an anthropologist, and Lu Zhe, who's a conservation biologist. So the first thing I would just point out is you can see that our team for the work that I'll be talking about today is quite an interdisciplinary group of people who've contributed to the research that I'll be discussing. So my lab generally has worked on, as Sergey pointed out, a variety of topics. And part of this reason is at my heart, I like to understand communication processes. Those processes can be applied to a variety of topics. And so you can see up in the corner, we've done everything. I joke with my students that we lurked outside of men's bathrooms to study their hand washing behavior. We've worked in childcare centers. We've worked on energy conservation issues, food waste, and a variety of topics. Methodologically, we use a variety of approaches to our research. The research I talk about today will cut across all those approaches, ranging from observational studies to in-depth interviews to focus groups to field experiments to lab experiments. So the stuff that I will talk about today cuts across all of those methodologies. One of the reasons our team is able to do that is because we've assembled expertise in all those areas to be able to analyze data in very different ways and to collect data in very different ways to answer complex questions. So we've cut across in our lab generally, we've cut across these various topics with a real fundamental desire to understand some basic communication processes and build theory in that space. Our research on social norms, particularly, which is what I'll be talking about today, has focused on a couple of big issues. One is how is normative information communicated? What makes behaviors more or less susceptible to normative influence? And how do norms evolve over time, which I think is probably one of the things that is more germane to this group and the interests of this group today. And I'll get into some of that today. Our project that I'm going to talk about today, we came to this project, the team that I introduced at the very beginning, in a couple of ways. And it actually started, interestingly, with a rejected grant proposal. And several of the people who were part of that initial rejection team got together and just started talking about our overlapping interest. And, I was the person who had studied social norms for many years in advance of this project. So I had experience in that literature. And what we talked about, and John Kerr, who worked in community sustainability, and Jinhua Zhao in economics, we started talking about the use of financial incentives to shape behaviors and the fact that financial incentives might also have some kind of impact on social norms. And this was quite a long time ago. I won't say how many years ago, but quite a long time ago. And what we saw was, and the reason for this picture with all these beautiful people in it, is that financial incentives were being used quite widely to promote health and environmental behaviors. And we talked about how we understand that financial incentives can't last forever, right? So oftentimes we might hear right now about initiatives to incentivize people to get a COVID vaccine or to get tested for COVID, right? Those are programs where there's a budget attached to doing it for that particular behavior, and that budget may or may not last through the course of how long we'll all be facing COVID, right? So you see this is true as well with other sorts of initiatives around conservation behaviors, around other health behaviors, around education, sending children to school, like offsetting the cost of sending children to school. So we were interested in this kind of the long-term effects of short-term incentives for behavior change. And we were also interested in blending the literature from communication where I work, which has a lot of theory around why and how social norms are formed and functioned, some of which I alluded to in the prior slide, but very little about financial incentives and what kind of the meaning that's attached to financial incentives and what ultimately financial incentives can do to shape our way of thinking about an issue or shape our behaviors. And we wanted to blend that thinking with the literature from economics and payment for ecosystem services from the sustainability field, where there's a very long-standing understanding of the role of financial incentives in behavioral action, but less theories about social norms particularly. So we wanted to blend what we saw as kind of the strengths of those two approaches, or kind of three approaches at that time. So before I begin, I know this is a diverse audience, and I want to just point out a couple of terms that I might throw around, and I don't want to do so without telling you where I'm coming from with these, understanding that we all may have different definitions of these ideas or of these concepts, but I'm just going to tell you where I'm coming from. When I talk about social norms and their moderators, I usually refer to injunctive social norms and descriptive social norms. And when I'm talking about injunctive social norms, what I mean is what ought to be done, and this implies some kind of social sanctions for noncompliance with that norm. Descriptive social norms, on the other hand, are perceptions of the prevalence, or are the prevalence of the behavior, and either one of these things may exist at the collective, that is at the level of the system, social system, but it might also exist at the level of people's perception, right? So perceived injunctive norms or perceived descriptive norms. Much of our research has specified the moderators of the relationship between social norms and behavior. That is, the things that we're largely interested in seeing what makes social norms more impactful on our behaviors or less impactful on our behaviors, right? And so one of the moderators that I'll talk about particularly today, and we have a bunch of things that we've tested or tried to understand, but today I'll talk in part about group identification, and that is how closely I identify with other members of my in-group, or how closely connected I am to those folks who make up my in-group. Financial incentives or behavioral payment programs. What I mean by this is just simply programs that provide people with some kind of financial compensation for engaging in pro-social behaviors. PES programs, payment for ecosystem services programs, are one kind of these programs that is particularly around paying people to engage in some kind of conservation or ecosystem protective behavior. And these payments may occur at the level, and in either case, we're interested in payments that occur at the level of the individual. However, that's not always the case. They might occur at the level of the collective. They might be conditional. They might not be conditional. There's a whole bunch of ways you can slice and dice these different financial incentive programs. We're focused mainly on programs that provide payments to individuals for engaging in some kind of behavior, because from a social norm standpoint, that makes things cleaner and easier to study. The last term I'll mention here is the financial incentives and normative systems model. And this is a model that our team developed. And the broad goal of this model is to predict and explain the ways in which social norms and behaviors are shaped by financial incentives over time. And I will show you a picture of the broad conceptual idea here. You can see, if we start in the middle, payment for ecosystem services programs, in this case, are a form of intervention. Many of you are familiar with that term. But a PES, it could be a different form of intervention. It could be communication messages. It could be some sort of lifestyle intervention. It could be a technology intervention, et cetera. We're going to talk today about PES as the intervention down here at the bottom. And those are typically, PES programs are designed to influence people's decisions or actions related to some kind of ecosystem outcomes. And so if you see the left-hand side there, PES influences people's decisions in some way. We pay people to plant trees. That influences their decision to plant trees. This has some kind of ecosystem or human or animal health impacts. And then those impacts continue to reinforce or not reinforce those decisions, depending on the nature of the outcomes. On the left-hand side, this is kind of the crux of what I'll be talking about today. We see that PES has a direct influence on actions. Excuse me. But also on our gosh, I'm sorry, our social norms. And our decisions and actions influence our perceptions of social norms as well. All right, sorry, I've been sick and you can tell, right? So this is the overarching conceptual model. As you can see, time is an element in this model. And I want to point out that, from this, we've been able to derive testable hypotheses and research questions, some of which I will mention today. So I'm going to talk about some things at a fairly high level today, as opposed to talking about specific studies. I'm going to talk about these studies, but I'm going to talk about just the findings from these studies and then provide some kind of summative comments and ideas from those studies. Some things that overarch these studies. So this program of research really started with what I'll call Experiment Zero. It really was a simple public goods experiment, and it was designed to test, number one, whether the effects of norms and incentives, what those look like on behaviors over time, and the effects of incentives, particularly on the formation and change of social norms over time. And so, as I said, this was a public goods experiment. I won't go into all of the details of it, but we varied whether or not participants were sorted into groups based on their participation in one round, and then people were randomly assigned to either receive a financial incentive for cooperative behavior in round 2, and then have that incentive removed in round 3, or to not receive any kind of incentive at all. And perceived descriptive norms were measured, and contribution behaviors to the collective pool were measured as the outcomes. A couple of the key findings of this initial study, what we saw was that norms varied over the course of the experiment. And I'll show you here on the next slide, you can see kind of the trend. This is the unconditional responses to this question about perceived descriptive norms. That is, I think most people in my group are acting in a way that is cooperative. And you can see this broken out by condition. So you can see that it changes depending on the condition people were in, and it varies over the course of the experiment. We also saw that incentives and perceived descriptive norms both contributed to contribution behaviors. That is, they had direct effects, whether or not people received incentives and their perception of what the descriptive norm was. That is, what they believe other people were doing influenced what they decided to do as well. Over the course of the experiment, what we saw was incentives actually weakened any positive effects of perceived descriptive norms on behaviors. And this lingered once the incentive was ended. That is, introducing and then removing the incentive actually weakened the power of social norms on behaviors. The last thing that I mentioned we were interested in this study is whether or not incentives and other behaviors were influencing people's perceptions of descriptive norms. And indeed, what we saw was incentives did influence what people saw as normative, or what they perceived as normative, as did what other people around them were doing. Okay, so their perceptions of norms co-occurred with what others, with what actual behaviors were going on around them. And that seems a little intuitive, but it's not always the case that perceptions and reality, so to speak, right, the collective norm, are actually associated with each other. And then finally, the effects of perceived descriptive norm were stronger when people were more strongly identified with their group members. So norms were more impactful on people's actions when they were closely connected to the people in their group. We've already seen that. So this initial experiment was exciting for us and provided some initial results to test our thinking about the fins. And of course, we wanted to test that in a more deep way, and to address a couple of the limitations of that research. One is this was a decontextualized study with a student sample. We wanted to, as Sergey said, I have a real interest in applying social science research to problems to see if the findings operate in the same way that you would see within a decontextualized experiment. We also wanted to test some of these ideas within a particular population. And I'll tell you a little bit about that population in a minute, but you can see from the picture, this is actually the Tibetan Plateau in China. And this is where most of the research that I'll talk about today was conducted. And finally, that first study really had a focus on descriptive norms, and we wanted to dig more deeply into injunctive norms as well. So here I present to you, these were the goals of this next set of projects that I want to describe. This took place over the course of almost 10 years. And so I'm really cramming a lot into this short presentation, but I've tried to highlight just the big findings. And at the bottom of each slide where I talk briefly about the findings, there's a link to a paper where we describe these findings in more detail, but I'm just kind of pulling out the highlights. And I do want to say it was quite an undertaking to summarize all this stuff and really figure out what the meaning of it all is, even though I've done some of that as I tried to translate these findings into practical recommendations. So the overarching goals of this project were to understand norms, concepts, and cultural context, and develop a culturally grounded measure of social norms. We wanted to test the predictions of a FINS model, our FINS model, within this particular cultural context, and then translate our theoretical and empirical findings in order to make recommendations for PES interventions. As I mentioned, the study site for our project, and really the place that we've been working for quite a long time now, is this particular region on the west, sort of Midwest part of China. You can see in Qinghai province, we worked with Shanshui Conservation Organization, and you can see the little flags are places where our conservation organization partners had study sites. And so they were a real key part of everything that I describe here, because they have folks who are working on the ground. They work with local communities. They have people from local communities working for their organization, et cetera. This region is characterized, so you can see from the picture, it's characterized by, of course, a very important environmental context, and that is the three largest rivers in China are the headwaters, or these three rivers feed into all of Southeast Asia, and ultimately provide drinking water for many, many countries and billions of people downstream from there. There's sensitive grasslands up there, endangered species, et cetera. So it's a very ecologically sensitive region, and a place where there's PES programs, payment for ecosystem services programs, that are already happening and planned for that region. The second major reason for choosing this study site is the region is populated, almost 90% of the population are ethnically Tibetan pastoralists. So the region is characterized by people who basically herd animals or farm in some form for a living, largely through herding. And so this is a group of people who have there's been research documenting a strong conservation ethic. So we also thought this was another sort of interesting element to study as we were studying this question. And of course, we had a strong partnership with folks already working in this region. And this just gives you another visual of this area and where it sits in the map of China above, and what the Yushu Autonomous Prefecture within Qinghai looks like. Here's a picture of it that's probably more compelling than the other ones. And you can see it's characterized by mountains and watershed. It's in the foothills of the Himalayas as well. So I want to talk about each of these goals and what we did towards these things just briefly. As I mentioned, our first goal was to understand norms, concepts, and cultural context, and develop a culturally grounded measure of social norms. On this slide, you can see the process by which we did this. And I know that there's a lot here, but I'm just going to mention these. I'm going to talk first about these first two things, and then I'll talk briefly about the rest of this process. So we started out initially, we had done several visits back and forth with our partners and having discussions about possible ways to approach this project and possible conceptualizations and ideas around social norms and payment for ecosystem services and how something like this would even look. But from there, we really dug into understanding if you're talking about social norms, you have to be thinking about we have to think about behaviors, right? So one of our major questions was, what are the behaviors, and this is very sort of downstream, that are most meaningful, both for our population and for payment or for conservation practice, right? And we settled on a couple of key sets of practices. And you can see on the left-hand side here, there's a yak. And so I mentioned earlier that for this population, herding is a very central part of everyday life. It is what many people within the region do to make money. The whole landscape is covered by grasslands and by fenced pastures where people herd, sometimes collectively, sometimes individually. So practices and herding practices have a great deal of ecological impact in terms of impact on the grassland, the water quality, et cetera. So we were interested in that as one set of practices. The second set of practices includes, in this region, there are a number of endangered species, including in this picture, the endangered snow leopard, iconic species, right? But there's also a great deal of illegal poaching in that region. And so there's been efforts by the conservation organization with which we work to organize particular patrols to go out and intercede in poaching efforts, like removing traps from places, et cetera. So that was the second set of practices that we were interested in. I'll focus mainly on the stuff on the herding and land grazing practices, but we will talk as well just briefly about the trap removal work as well. So we started off our data collection, our first major data collection effort with in-depth interviews with 80 different people, asking questions at a very high level about who the sources of information are that they go to around these practices, et cetera. And I'll show you the research questions on the next slide. This just gives you a picture of some members of our team actually conducting the interviews in somebody's house. And this was not an unusual sight during the course of our data collection. These interviews were conducted in 4 villages, and we interviewed in this stage of the data collection only men because our collaborators thought that this was the appropriate place to start given their role as decision makers in the community for this particular topic. And some very high level questions that we had, we went in really with an open mind about how social norms are even conceptualized or thought about within this particular population, and who the important sources of information around these behaviors might be. So we asked these broad questions. Who are the collective and individual sources of information about the behaviors? What is the basis of interpersonal influence for these particular reference? That is why these reference, right? And not assuming that it's normative influence, but it might be some other form of influence. What factors shape decisions about these behaviors at a very high level? And what is the form of descriptive and injunctive norms? So now we're getting into kind of existing or indigenous conceptualizations of injunctive and descriptive norms, being open-minded, coming in with our knowledge base for what we see as injunctive and descriptive norms, as I described in the offset, but being open to alternative conceptualizations of those things. So I'll present just a bit of data from these interviews. We analyzed them in multiple ways. We did thematic analysis, also did quantitative coding of content, and did very rudimentary looking at networks like you see here. We asked questions about different types of information, and what we saw was different groups or individuals tend to be the sources or the people that people go to for this kind of information. So here you see reference for general issues related to their herding activities, like which animals to herd, what to do about what to do about their land cover, et cetera, right? So for general issues, you see that that their family members play a key role, in-group herdsmen, and village leaders. On the next slide, you see reference for advice seeking. This is when you want to ask somebody for advice about something in particular. And you can see here that leaders play an even more important role here. And there's more of a dispersal of sources of information around this topic, or sources of interpersonal communication about this issue. And then finally, for problem-solving information, you see that people reported being most likely to go to a veterinarian or a government official or a leader, and less likely to go to these other folks for interpersonal communication or discussions about this problems related to their herding activities. So our second big question, or one of our big questions in this set of data was, why these reference? Why are these people influential? What's the basis of their influence? And what we saw were a couple of key things. And this returns to some very old work from Kelman and French and Raven and others on the basis of power, right? It was back in the early days of social psychology, there was a lot of research on, what gives people power. So we returned to some of that literature, and you can see some of the things we saw within the thematic analysis in her study. Means control was one thing that came up quite regularly. And this is the idea that the other person or group of people that I go to for information or that I talk to about this issue, they control some resource that I need, or they have the ability to reward me in some way. Okay, we saw that quite regularly. Credibility, we saw people talk about quite regularly. That is, the person is an expert source of information. They know about this thing. I know I can go to them because they know. And then harmony, or the will of the majority. And this is something that we saw quite often, and it's not something that in my other data on social norms that I've collected from various places around the world that I ever saw expressed quite as explicitly as I have in this data. And that is, the referent can help maintain accord within our group in some way, or agreement among our group members is the only way to proceed with a particular course of action. And you can see some examples of quotes here. What we saw less of is this idea of identification or attractiveness of the source, which I mentioned above. Our question about what is the basis for decisions about herding, we heard people express information, they look to ecological conditions, they look to market forces, and these are my words, not theirs, right? These are the broad themes that emerge from our data, right? They look at ecological conditions, market forces, policies, as well as social factors, right? So we didn't want to privilege social factors or social norms as being, the thing that is driving this decision. We really had no solid idea of that going into this study because there wasn't other research on this in this particular population. But we did see that social factors, tradition, in-group relations, the power of the majority were talked about explicitly as a basis for their decisions about their herding practices. And then finally, in terms of descriptive and injunctive norms, we saw that people described information in the immediate environment about behavioral prevalence, right? So they described having information about what other people around them are doing from a set of very broad questions that we asked. Not, these weren't closed questions, or, we asked very open-ended questions about this and then coded their responses. They gathered this information from observation, from their knowledge of what policy said people were supposed to do, and from their interactions with family and herding group members. They did not report descriptive normative information beyond their local villages, though. So mostly this information was limited to their herding group members' knowledge of what herding group members were doing, as well as what people in their local village were doing, but not beyond that. And this makes sense because the geography of this region is gigantic, right? So from within a village can encompass large distances, and distance between villages are very, very far as well. So it's hard to, it's not like you can move easily between villages within this region. In terms of injunctive norms, information about approved and disapproved behaviors, we found people reported it was mainly communicated under problematic or uncertain conditions. And people would say things like, we're herders, we mostly just know what to do until something goes wrong. Then we start really talking about what's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, is in essence the kinds of things that people said, right? And people were willing to explicitly talk about the influence of others on their behaviors, as I mentioned, but they didn't ever talk explicitly about social sanctions, which is kind of a common element of conceptual definitions of injunctive norms. And then finally, religious leaders were most likely to communicate injunctive normative information, and to a lesser extent, this information came from herding group members. So we used this data as the basis for our quantitative the design of our quantitative measures of social norms. You can see on the next slide, and this is the process that we used. We developed scale items and these are a set of practices. We developed them within the language of participants, as well as in English and in Mandarin as well, because we had a multilingual research team. Boy, that was a whole thing that we could talk about. Took quite a lot of time. And then we conducted exploratory tests of those, and then engaged in formal piloting of the survey, and then did a household survey that is the basis for a subsequent set of results that I'll talk about here. So we tested these measures that we developed in a variety of ways, and this slide just lays out some of those methods that we used. These are the kinds of items that we designed, and you can see the variables that we measured here: perceived descriptive norms, perceived injunctive norms, outcome expectations, group identity, group orientation, which is kind of a form of collectivism. We measured actual behavior, but we also measured intentions to engage in a behavior. And then we used in the studies that I'll talk about in a second here, a variety of different response scales. Everything was verbally administered, or in this case, it was visually and verbally administered. This is a slide capture from some of the experimental manipulations, or the experimental study that I'm going to report, the field experiment, in just a moment here. But we also did administer these scales verbally during the household survey, and used digit counting fingers, right, as a way to ask people their responses. And we pre-tested and we developed those response scales based on discussions with community members and discussions with our project partners. So I'd like to transition to just mention a couple of key findings from some of the tests of our model. I'm just talking about these, as I mentioned, at a sort of high level here, but I want to summarize the things that we found in particularly two different studies. The first is a household survey, where as part of this household survey, we had an embedded experiment where participation in a herd size reduction program was the dependent variable. We varied both incentive and information about descriptive norms. And what we saw was that incentive, and this is data actually that we just analyzed recently, so I don't have a lot to say about this, but I'll just report what we have here. Incentives and descriptive norm treatment and perceptions of injunctive norms all had direct positive effects on willingness to participate in a herd reduction program. So as incentive increased, as normative information got more consistent with a high prevalence norm, and as I felt like more people wanted me to do this thing, I was more willing to actually take part in a herd size reduction program. And this is consistent with our prior research. It's consistent with other studies in the literature, but none with this particular population, and with some kind of small variances in the treatment that I won't get into. The interaction of incentives and social norms was not significant. So we didn't see that social norms and incentives work together in this case to influence behavioral decisions. But what we saw was when we ended the payment, so when we reported that a payment was about to end, and we asked people whether they would continue to reverse or what they would do, what we saw was that people, once the payment ended, people reversed any planned reductions in their herd size, and the larger the payment was, the greater their reversal. But what we saw was that a strong descriptive norm made that reversal less. Okay, so that's a positive for the potential effects of social norms. We wanted to further explore some of the questions in our field experiments. And so in this study, this is a field experiment. You can see some of the details of that above, where we wanted to look particularly at injunctive norms. And in this case, the dependent variable was days willing to volunteer for a patrol, poaching patrol program. And we used, in this case, a carefully framed incentive, and provided information about injunctive as opposed to descriptive norms. And what we saw in this study, which was, again, a public goods experiment, we saw that perceived injunctive norms and descriptive norms evolved over the course of the experiment. And I'll show you on the next slide and then come back to these other findings. And you can see here's perceived descriptive norms. And this is just a simple unconditional chart of the findings across the different rounds. And the different experimental conditions are laid out: a control, injunctive norms, message or information, a payment for engaging in the behavior, or a combination of payment and injunctive norms message, which you can see across the top is where perceived descriptive norms across the study were the highest. And then you can see here's perceived injunctive norms over the course of the study, broken out by each of the groups. And my point in showing you these slides is really to just show we see these differences across the course of the experiment, documenting on, of course, a very short scale, the ways that norms can change over the course of rounds of a study. What we also saw in this particular study was that incentives had a very weak direct effect on behavior. So normally you see when you have incentive programs, you see a fairly strong effect of incentives on behavior. Behaviors, I always joke, if you pay somebody to do something, they pretty much will. We really didn't see a very strong effect in this particular population. Indeed, what we saw was there was already a real high willingness to participate in this kind of program. So that is one potential explanation for this. But we did see that perceived injunctive norms had a positive effect on willingness to take part in this program. And what we saw is that others' behaviors in prior rounds and the presence of an incentive influenced perceived injunctive norms, and this effect mediated the effects of those variables on behavior. So perceived injunctive norms functioned as a mediator, basically, between other people's behaviors, the presence of an incentive, and people's ultimate decisions to engage in this behavior. So a couple of just quick summary comments about the findings of these studies. What we see from these studies just presented is that perceived norms around us change as behaviors around us change, which is fairly intuitive, but we also see from other research that those two things, our perceptions of norms and the actual collective norm, are not isomorphic. Both incentives and social norms have direct and combined effects on behavioral decisions. That is, they have direct, the incentives can increase behavioral willingness or decisions to take an action. Social norms can do the same. And then they also have combined effects. And that when incentive ends, behaviors typically can end as well or reduce as well, and the norm may be changed after that point in time. So incentives have the power to shift social norms or change social norms. They can change what people perceive as normative, and then ultimately they shape what people actually decide to do. And then we also see from this last study that social norms can be supportive of behaviors once incentive ends. We've seen from the early study that I reported, social norms can actually hurt a functional social norm, in that case, a functional descriptive norm, but we also see that, financial incentives. Financial incentives can also help to support behaviors if those norms are still in place once the incentive program ends. So a lot of our work has been dealing with how do you allow that to happen? How does that happen, right? And part of what we've been studying is these kind of careful framing of incentives and how you describe incentives, how you communicate incentives, of course, how you design those incentives, right? Those things all matter in terms of how people respond to those sorts of programs, and then ultimately how, what the long-term impacts of those kinds of programs are for social norms and for behaviors. And so you can see we return to our FINS model. We have focused largely on this gray right-hand side here, and I add these moderators up here in the right-hand corner: group identification, group orientation. These are all things that seem to have an impact on the effects of social norm. And then we add this intervention no longer is just PES, right? But we discovered from our work that not only can PES have an impact, but also information about social norms and perceptions of social norms have an impact. So we want to be more thoughtful about the nature of this intervention ultimately, and how we communicate financial incentive programs or technology programs, et cetera, whatever that intervention may look like. So, so one of the big goals of this project was to take all these findings, and this was a huge collaboration between ourselves and Shan Shui and other conservation groups, and figure out what this really means for practice. And I won't go through all of those recommendations, but I'll give you an example of the kinds of things that we gathered together as a group. Here is an example of what we call our PES one-pager, which is one kind of thing that we created as a result of all this investigation, to really come up with some ways. All right, if we know that social norms matter, what does this mean for the development of PES programs? What role can carefully designed communication, maybe it's strategic communication of some kind, right? How does that play a role in this? And we talk a little bit about recommendations for doing that. What role do leaders play in this? What role do other motives play? And then finally, some issues of clarity that we saw in other data that I didn't report here. So this is just an example of how we took our findings from all this research and summarized it into one page, which is something, and tried to make some real concrete recommendations along with our project partners for what this means for practice. We also, this is kind of there's some serious elements to this and there's some funny elements to this. You can see we had a number of, and this just shows you a couple of meetings with conservation leaders from around the Shan Shui organization, but also from non-governmental and conservation organizations from around Beijing. That's the picture on the right there. You can see my colleague with his hands up, that's Jinhua Zhao, who's going between English and Mandarin in this case, and with our colleague who speaks Tibetan on the side that you can't, I don't think you can see him there right now, but going between languages, trying to describe some of the findings and what they mean. And then down in the bottom corner here is some important team building. One of our team members and I trying to sing Taylor Swift's 22 on karaoke, which turns out it's hard no matter what language you use. She's more complex than we give her credit for. So, so these are some ways that we tried to share and take the findings of our work back to the community in which we worked. And I want to just leave you with a few takeaway points here. So this research shows that incentives can shape both behaviors and normative perceptions, causing both positive and negative impacts, both while they're in place and when they're removed. And I want to just highlight the obvious here, which is these are short, the evolution element here is over the course of very short-term experiments, right? And my last point here is there needs to be more long-term, obviously long-term studies of social norms, and there are some out there, but we need more understanding of how these programs work over the long haul. We know that social norms can shape behavior, but they are only one source of motivation. And I've alluded to some during the course of this talk to some of the other sources of motivation. And Sergey and I have talked at length about this, about some of the other sources of motivation. So those factors, of course, are important to consider as well. And our focus here has really been on the normative and social system elements. Finally, two big points I'd like to make. One is incentive programs like PES are only one approach to promoting pro-social behaviors and should be considered with care. I talk with people all the time and I'm working with a group right now out of the Carter Center who've been looking at how to, they've been using incentives to promote particular health behaviors. To me, I always, there is a clear benefit of using incentive programs, but I would just caution that there are other ways that you can shape and influence behavior, including, through understanding social norms and the role of leaders and interpersonal communication, also through strategic communication activities, right? So understanding that there are both costs and benefits to using incentive systems like PES and very carefully considering the design of those programs and the potential perverse outcomes is certainly one thing that we can see from our research. And this is something that's been called for in the research in economics or in PES particularly as well. And then finally, there are strategies for designing incentive programs that might help maximize some of these good outcomes. And we provided some examples of these. There are other examples from the literature, but the overarching point here is just that the use of these kinds of incentive programs for promoting pro-social behaviors have to be designed with care and maybe thought about as thinking through the long-term consequences of these issues as well as the short-term potential impacts. So with that, I will close. I will leave you with this beautiful scene from this region where we've done our work. Give an acknowledgement here. The primary funder for this research is the U.S. National Science Foundation, but we have received support from all of these organizations here for our work, and we are very appreciative of that. And you can see the names of other people who've helped with various things that I presented here. So with that, I will say thank you. I will share the slides so you'll be able to access these, and these are some other resources available, and there's references at the end of this. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and put my face forward here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria. Great talk. Thank you. While people are thinking about questions, let me ask you one. So incentives can be good. But there are also cases where we have an opposite effect. For example, Sam Bowles, I think he wrote the whole book on this. And kind of one of his favorite examples was the case of a daycare center in Israel, where we are trying to reduce the number of parents who are late, and we introduce fines. And as a result of this, we got completely opposite effect. Can you comment on this and how it fits the general theory of social norms and incentives?
Yeah, I mean, so I see that as that's the example that I refer to most often when I'm talking about our work, because it really exemplifies why we're doing this work, right? Which is incentives are one strategy for shaping people's decisions, right? Or for getting them to engage in things that they maybe have other motivations for doing. And if you highlighted those other motivations, and part of my work when I'm not thinking about financial incentives is thinking about how communication functions in the absence of financial incentives, right? So before I worked on this project, I never, ever would have considered using financial incentives as a way to get people to uptake behaviors, right? What I do is health communication and environmental communication, where we're really focused on how you can show people the benefit, for example, the benefits of engaging in a behavior and what they will personally gain, not monetarily, right? But maybe they'll be more connected to a group. Maybe they will gain new relationships. Maybe they will get more money in their pocket, which is a kind of incentive, right? Or maybe they'll, whatever. There's all kinds of other benefits that people may gain by doing these behaviors, right? So part of my point, and I'm really glad you asked this question, is to really say, yes, incentives are a strategy that's very widely used, but from our perspective, there are a lot of costs. There are a lot of potential costs. We've highlighted only the costs related to social norms. Other researchers have highlighted the costs, for crowding, the literature on crowding out of other forms of motivation. And I think it's really important to keep that in the front of our mind. Our thinking is that if incentives are very carefully crafted and combined with appropriate communication, that you can try to mitigate some of those effects. The problem is the research is not very robust in that area, and our own research is very just nascent in that area. So I don't have a good, the answer is a very broad, we think that can help, because when we just completed a big review of incentive, blah, blah. It isn't published, and I don't really want to talk that much about it, but we just completed this giant review of the incentives literature. And we saw in that review very clearly that there's still a very, there's so much variability in how these incentive programs are crafted and implemented and what they look like. And that has clear implications for how people respond to them. And then when you're trying to get into how these are communicated or how social norms are addressed or how community dynamics are addressed, right? There's there's a lot going on there. It's very hard to summarize across that literature to really see the strong lessons. And there are some papers that have done some really nice summaries. So I could refer you to those. But so that's a long answer to say, yes, I completely agree. I agree with your question here.
All right. Thank you, Maria. Yeah, we have some questions from the audience. The first one, I suppose it does depend on where incentives come from, leaders, collectives, or just individuals. Did you look at this?
Yeah, and so this is a really good point. And this part of the framing. So in the third study, the third experiment that I presented, we actually framed the incentives and very carefully talked about the source of those incentives. And what we saw was that certainly did make a difference. So when you describe the nature of the source of that incentives, what we saw in that particular study was it functioned to signal like legitimacy of the behavior, right? And I don't know how far this would travel beyond our particular study, but by attaching an incentive to a particular behavior, it basically communicated to people like, hey, this is something that somebody's is willing to pay for, right? And so that was something, that is a particular case. We also see that depending on whether the incentive is given to an individual or to a collective or to a leader within a community, that drives how people respond to it as well. So that also shapes the dynamics attached to incentives. So certainly that does make a difference. And we continue to do small experiments kind of varying the source and the description of an incentive. But again, that's something that has to be done very carefully, and it has to be done within context and without deception. So it's hard to do in a lot of experiments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Your schematic shows that group identity influences social norms and behavior. Did you find or look at feedback there so that behavior and perhaps descriptive norms generate stronger group identification as well?
Yes, we did. And we, and I don't remember the finding. We did that in our very first study, and we actually didn't report it in that study. And I don't remember the findings off the top of my head. And so I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, but that is a very feasible thing that can happen within these studies in particular. So what we do know is that over the course of, we know what we documented within that study is group identity changes over the course. We measured group identity, right? So it changes over the course of that experiment. Now, what it's exactly related to, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know that it does evolve as the experiment goes on, and that makes sense. And you see this with small group studies where over the course of a task, other forms of small group studies where they're interactive, interpersonal group studies where you see identification growing. And oftentimes you see efforts, and some of my own research has tried to enhance the sense of identity with their group. So the childcare study that I presented at the very beginning, we made efforts in that study to try and, nudge, I hate to use that word because it's such a hot word right now, but to make salient this idea that you're part of this group, that's really, you've told us is very meaningful to you as a way to enhance the effects of social norms. And we see that indeed identity, as you, build relationships with people, do more things with people, have more tasks with people, whatever the experimental context is, that does indeed enhance group identification.
Thank you. Yeah, let me ask a couple more questions from the audience, and then I'll check with our panelists if they have anything to ask. The next one, super interesting. I came in late from another meeting, so sorry if you covered this earlier. I've been thinking about analogies or disanalogies between the challenges of climate change and the challenges of COVID, especially in their susceptibility to norm-based interventions. So the question is, do any important or intriguing similarities or differences come to mind or leap out at you, given your perspective on the way norms and incentives interact?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, both of these things, what immediately jumped out at me is, climate change is the longer term, problem, sort of intractable problem of our time in a way, I would describe it. And we actually just wrote a paper on, what are the best strategies for communicating about climate change, given where we are at this point in time in the world. And part of what we see there is we actually stayed largely away from social norms in that particular paper, but really talked about highlighting other benefits of climate change mitigation behaviors outside of climate change benefits. So looking at more personal level benefits that people receive from engaging in climate change mitigation behaviors. If we're taking individual action in this case. There's this issue of the fact that climate change has this whole set of baggage attached to it, and that it's got a whole set of practices attached to it, whereas COVID is a relatively new risk. It's got direct personal health outcomes potentially, but it does share that political element, of course, that climate change has as well, right? So that's, I guess, just a starting point for some ideas. In terms of the influence of social norms, I think if we think about descriptive and injunctive norms in particular, we have some data right now. We have actually like 5 months of evolution of COVID attitudes, and social norms, which are just being analyzed. And we see that those social normative perceptions are very closely connected to political ideologies right now. And this is not a surprise to anybody, but we're just kind of documenting this through some of our research. And we're also seeing this pattern of evolution of normative perceptions related to COVID-19 as well. So those are just and those are around descriptive and injunctive norms. One more quick thing I guess I'd mention, and that is COVID does have this kind of observability element with the whole mask thing. That is just a real simple way of saying, when we can see other people engaging in a behavior, and I know there's a number of people on this talk who've studied this as well, and we've done a little bit of research on this, but when you have external symbols of behavioral enactment, it has a lot of power, right? We can either see people with masks or we see people without masks, right? And that alone gives us this daily sort of reinforcement of the norm, whatever that norm looks like within our various communities. And that's something that I think is pretty unique, right? We don't have because climate change is encompasses such a wide set of practices, right? We don't have a one thing, right? So somebody driving a car isn't like, oh, you're contributing to climate change. But somebody not wearing a mask right now, you're like, oh, don't you care about me, right? So it's a different kind of observability that we have with COVID right now that I think is a real key dynamic to the normative evolution at this point.
Thank you. Maria, I know that you have a class just after this, so I guess you need to decide if you want to continue answering questions or if you have to go, because
maybe I'll just take one more question. I'm sorry, everybody. I have a 3-hour grad class right now that I have to go teach, so I'm like on all day today. So
okay. Let me ask our panelists if they have. Tom.
Hi.
Thanks, Maria. Really enjoyed the talk, and I'm working on similar issues with Kenyan pastoralists. One of the things that I've been thinking about is the methods to look at changes in norms. And so you mentioned how in the experimental situation you had norms that were changing during the course of the experiment. And I wanted to get your thoughts about whether you think the processes involved in the changes in those experiments are the same or similar to the processes that we see in the real world.
No, not really. The answer is no. So we struggle. I mean, it has similarities, right? And so my real theoretical interest is in what are the things that sort of spike changes in norms? Or that's one of the whole intervention idea is how do these interventions shape changes in norms, right? And so everything we do has corollaries in the real world. And I would say something like a COVID epidemic is a kind of shock to the system, so to speak, right? That's going to spark changes. But I definitely think, and this was sort of my call at the end there, to doing more. And so our study on COVID norms right now is a rolling cross-sectional study with a national sample where we're actually measuring, we have 20 waves of data over the course of several months where we're tracking perceived social norms, perceived injunctive norm, perceived descriptive norms, moral norms, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But we're also overlaying that with people's actual behaviors and a whole bunch of, we have a computer scientist on the project who's gathering Twitter data and other social data that you can't get through asking people things, right? So I'm also looking at new methodologies for doing this. I think, the multiple round experiment is one way to simulate the idea of time, right? And that was what was exciting to me about it. But it's a very limited, it's got its limitations, of course. And I think that there are I think we have to get really creative with methods for studying this over the course of time. And there's a lot to capture there, right? When we just look at the stuff we're doing on COVID, even knowing what the right things are to capture in the social system requires a lot of theorizing about, okay, what's going to really matter here and what's not going to matter in terms of shaping norms. I hope that answers your question a little. What kinds of things have you been thinking about I'm interested in?
So first of all, thank you very much for the answer. So we've been looking at various things. So one of them was around interventions to kind of prevent lion killing in pastoralists and kind of stopping human-wildlife conflict in that sense. And there have been various incentives there that have been put in place around payments for lost cattle and stuff like that. But the problem is it's difficult to assess that because the incentive system hasn't been rolled out properly. So you don't know whether it's not working because of norms or it's not working because it hasn't been implemented properly and lack of trust and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's a real problem with studying real world applications of incentives. And this is something that we really struggled with at the offset of this particular project, because what we really wanted to do was look at something, where the incentive system was in place. But the only way to really do that in the best case scenario is to have a bunch of money and create a new incentive system, right? And we could perhaps, there's a chance that we could perhaps do that in this particular case still. But what you're pointing out is a real challenge in the incentives, because a lot of what you're doing is, post hoc explaining why things look the way they do. And it's often hard to capture all the possible whys, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're looking at other things to do with kind of communal management of rangelands and kind of the new systems that are being set up to manage that and how that matches on or doesn't match to traditional systems and things like that. But so that's all kind of new stuff. So we don't know what the answers are yet. But it'd be great to talk about that a bit more sometime in the future when you've got more time.
I would love to talk about it more. Yeah, we've been thinking about. I mean, the recommendation to really start with community data and community input. And if you look at, there are conservation organizations that do this. One that I'm familiar with is Conservation International. They generally start with a very deep understanding of communal structures, of existing norms, and not in a sciencey norm kind of way, but we understand how collectives work. We understand who the thought leaders are within the community, who the tribal, et cetera. They oftentimes have some programs where they've done that very well. And I don't know how widespread that is. That's one we actually have started a sort of listing of conservation programs that are using incentive systems, and we're trying to look at those more carefully to learn. We've worked with some of them, but we don't know what everybody's doing. And some of our project partners have worked with Conservation International and others. So there are all kinds of different ways that in conservation, particularly, they're using pretty sophisticated ways of understanding existing social structures before putting incentive systems in place. But there's a lot to know to be able to do that well, I think.
Yeah, that's the stage we're at the moment now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Maria. And sorry that you have to go, but yeah, we understand. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Oh,
Do
yeah.
you mind capturing the questions for me? Can you do that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We will do it.
Questions so I can look at them later because it'll
Exactly,
help me understand what people are
exactly,
thinking about.
Yeah. All Q&As will be on the webpage, but we will also email you the file.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And my apologies, everybody, for having to run out of here. But
No problem. We understand.
in the name of education.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, everybody. It's been a great series, and we hope we'll continue it in the fall. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.